Hey y'all, welcome back. Today we're checking out Before Black Sabbath, how psychedelic rock became metal.
Rock and roll used to be the gnarliest, heaviest genre in town. A genre that embodied rebellion, fast cars, and the loudest guitars that late 1950s music had to offer. But as the 60s wore on, coffee and rebellion seemed positively childish. Popular music needed something harder, and more in sync with the sex and drugs part of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Enter psychedelic rock. Similar to good old rock and roll, but with mind-expanding themes, and an intense interest in a girl called Lucy, who was in the sky with diamonds. But the summer of love came and went. The Vietnam War didn't end, and the Manson murders made it so that the positivity of the movement seemed blind. A darker sound was needed, and appeared in the form of metal. The bastard child of rock and roll and psychedelic rock. Metal was harder, heavier, and louder than anything before, and became one of the most important genres of all time. But how did we get there? What were the steps along the way, the key tracks and influences? And how did we get from Johnny B. Good to Black Sabbath in 12 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. 12 years from Chuck Berry to Black Sabbath. What a time. I don't feel like music changes as much anymore. Can you imagine taking Black Sabbath, going back in time 12 years, and having Black Sabbath open for Chuck Berry? Would the crowd scatter, or would they love it? Probably some of both. Crazy. Y'all be sure to go to Trash Theory and like and subscribe.
This is how psychedelic rock became metal.
How rock and roll became psychedelic rock, 1955 to 1965. Chuck Berry, Eddie Cochran to the Kingsmen and the Kinks. Song Maybelline, Chuck Berry.
Maybelline.
The origin of metal, if you want to go all the way back, starts sometime in the 1950s with Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Bill Haley and the Comets, and Chuck Berry. These men are the beginnings of guitar-based rock and roll, so 1955's Maybelline by Berry is a good starting point as any, as it combined country and western licks with an R&B template.
Maybelline, why can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline, why can't you be true?
It also featured Berry's electric guitar as a showy lead instrument, which previously had been mostly relegated to rhythm, which he then further refined by the release of 1958's Johnny B. Good.
The Dog Walk.
Berry inspired pretty much all guitar-based music forever after.
That's amazing.
But some immediate converts were Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and for proto-metal purposes, Eddie Cochran. The latter's singles, Summertime Blues and Come On Everybody, continued Berry's evolution of the electric guitar, experimenting with distortion and multi-tracking.
But there ain't no cure for the summertime blues.
His stuttering guitar motif, an original idea that British invasion bands would leap on.
Right,
As
he was
such,
British,
in
right?
1958, his rebellious anthems were the heaviest thing you could hear on the radio.
Hey, look at them.
But that was mostly down to the actual heavier sound of 1958, being Rumble by Link Wray.
All right. Y'all, that song is in a lot of movies, isn't it? It's in Pulp Fiction. Maybe that's what's making me think of it. It's in other ones though, right? It's in other movies. I don't know, maybe not.
By slicing his amp speaker cone and playing extremely loud, Ray was able to create a song so distorted, feedback-drenched, and raucous that despite having no lyrics, it was banned from US radio due to its deemed potential to incite juvenile delinquency.
Really?
Inspired in part by Ray, and a need to push what a guitar could do to its limits. In 1962, king of surf rock, Dick Dale released Missoula. Legend has it
Also Pulp Fiction.
that during a performance, Dale was bet by a young fan that he could not play a song with only one string of his guitar, remembering an old Middle Eastern folk song that his uncle used to play on a single string of an oud. Dale took this and turbocharged the tempo to make it rock and roll. The result is a song that seriously shreds, way before there were songs that shredded. During this time, inspired by Johnny B. Good's tale of rock and roll success and everything since.
I don't think this style is working for them. The 1700s soldier style, I guess, fell out of style.
Johnny B. Good's tale of rock and roll success and everything since. Teenagers across the US formed garage rock bands in an attempt to try it for themselves, playing a rudimentary chord-heavy version of rock and roll. One of the early successes was The Kingsmen, with their incomprehensible classic, Louie Louie, which peaked at number 2 in the Billboard chart.
Wow, that was 63.
On the other side of the Atlantic, the British invasion bands were creating their own spin on rock and roll, with the heavily distorted ka-chunk of the Kinks' You Really Got Me from 1964 being the first point where you could dub a track proto-metal. The Rolling Stones' I Can't Get No Satisfaction.
Interesting. I heard recently, I heard a story about Satisfaction, and he's using a fuzz pedal, and the fuzz pedal was originally advertised as a way for a guitar player to get horn sounds, to play horn lines. It does kind of sound like a saxophone, trumpet, trombone type of thing. And I heard, I don't know if it's true, but I'm going to spread the rumor. I heard that they put this guitar line down, but they wanted to replace it later with horns. But they never did. That's what I heard. Probably wrong. Spreading rumors here. Talking out my ass.
And The Who's Substitute would arrive the next year, continuing the race to see who could make a song so heavy it was no longer rock.
Wow. Okay. The 13th Floor Elevators. 1966, You're Gonna Miss Me. Song, You're Gonna Miss Me. The 13th Floor Elevators. Okay. I don't know if I've heard this song.
Psychedelic rock existed in part before the 13th Floor Elevators, whether it be in the droning guitar of the Beatles' Ticket to Ride,
Classic.
or the Yardbirds' Heart Full of Soul, or the acid rock of Grateful Dead. But never had it been as unflinchingly gnarly as on the Elevators' 1966 debut single, You're Gonna Miss Me. It was not necessarily heavier, but with its references and consumption of psychedelic drugs, it definitely was heavy.
Oh, I was gonna say, those guitars sound pretty clean. His voice is kind of distorted, but...
And compared to the Elevators' Rory Erickson, the Beatles and Yardbirds were merely day trippers. With the velocity of Erickson's Little Richard-style wail, healthy implementation of the electric jug, and driving chunky riffage, You're Gonna Miss Me
Electric
proved
jug.
that psychedelic rock could be much more than acoustic sing-alongs. It could hit you hard and in a concise manner.
Hang on. Electric jug? You can't just skate over that.
Now hold the jug like this.
What the f***? Oh, alright. Okay.
Electric jug and driving chunky riffage. You're Gonna Miss Me proved that psychedelic rock could be much more than acoustic sing-alongs. It could hit you hard and in a concise manner. The electric jug, an invention of the band's Tommy Hall, was used to aid in evoking the mind-altering experience of LSD, an attempt to put acid into the song. Despite never properly breaking through, the band would influence a whole generation of proto-punks and put a harder-edged version of psychedelic rock on the map.
Huh. I'm surprised the electric jug didn't catch on. It I can't do it. The British Invasion Bands, 1966 to 67. Norwegian Wood, Painted Black, and I Can See for Miles. Song Norwegian Wood, the Beatles, y'all.
By 1966, British invasion bands like the Beatles, The Who, and the Rolling Stones were turning to psychedelia. The Beatles having released Rubber Soul the year before with its trippy experimentation on tracks like Norwegian Wood. The rest were playing catch up. Musically, the Rolling Stones' Painted Black has very little to do with what metal would become. But in 1966, its lyrical bleakness was a counterpoint to the sunny optimism of their fellow psychedelic bands. Right. Amid Brian Jones' superior sitar melody and Charlie Watts' tribal drums, Mick Jagger outlines a tale of utter hopelessness.
I look inside myself and see my heart is black.
That might be my favorite Rolling Stones song.
Jagger has said, it's the beginnings of miserable psychedelia. That's what the Rolling Stones started. The song and its lyrical themes would become associated with the Vietnam War, which in turn would bleed into the darker, heavier music that would appear near the end of the decade. Out of the British invasion bands, The Who were the loudest, heaviest band around. As early as 1965's My Generation, they were implementing riotous drums, bass solos, and distortion to thrilling effect. Helping the process was a bigger, louder wall of Marshall amps approach that pushed The Who's sheer volume to the limits of 60s PA systems. In 1967, The Who released I Can See for Miles, one of their few delves into psychedelia proper. Despite having dreamy three-part harmonies and a mind-stretching chorus, it was not the hit that guitarist Pete Townsend had assumed, reaching only number 10 in the UK charts.
That's good.
To me, it was the ultimate Who record, yet it didn't sell. I spat on the British record buyer. One reviewer for its parent album, The Who Sells Out, stated that the track was the heaviest he'd ever heard. This would be the spark and challenge for another British invasion band to try and outdo them. But that's later. First.
Oh, so the story I heard about I Can See for Miles is that it inspired Paul McCartney to write Helter Skelter? Or he had already written Helter Skelter, but it was like a blues song. But when he heard I Can See for Miles on the radio, he thought, I gotta make it heavy as possible. It was pretty heavy. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, 1967, Purple Haze, and If 6 Were 9, song Purple Haze, the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
In 1966, Jimi Hendrix was an unknown, playing to handfuls of dazzled fans in New York basements, getting by as a session musician for acts like Little Richard,
Wow, that's Jimi Hendrix playing.
and the Isley Brothers.
That sounds like him.
On the 22nd of September, he moved to London, financed by his new manager, the Animals' Chaz Chandler. Hendrix's version of Electric Blues made him an instant hit with England's rock royalty, whereas British rock musicians were trying to ape American blues. What Hendrix brought to his psychedelic sound was a love of jazz, which aided his improvisational live style, and an appreciation for the classical greats, expanding his sound further. Joined by drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding, they formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Link Wray and The Who had been experimenting with distortion beforehand, but nothing at that point had sounded as downright intimidating as the opening stuttering, overdriven riff of Purple Haze. By the song's shit-hot solo, the band had reached another plane of existence.
There's a story Paul McCartney tells about how he went to a bar It was sitting at a bar, and there was a stage across the room, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience was playing. There was nobody in there. There were maybe 5 people in the room. And then about a week later, he went back to see Jimi Hendrix again, and this time the room was full of people. So word got out quick.
The Experience's next release, Axis Bold as Love, would feature If 6 Were 9, not only a denouncement of 1967's Summer of Love and its hippie-ish do-nothingism.
Hippies, cut off all their hair. I don't care.
Further predicting the cultural darkness to come. But Mitchell's start-stop style would inspire Black Sabbath on War Pigs.
Oh. That does sound like War Pigs. I didn't notice that. Wow. I've heard both of those songs at least 100 times, and I never noticed that. What in the world?
Hendrix would inspire every soloist since, but particularly Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and later Eddie Van Halen. His impact on metal cannot be understated.
Wow. Isn't that interesting? If Jimi Hendrix lived, he may have been a metal player. I've heard stories about towards the end of his life, like the last year or so, things weren't going so great, and he sort of knew that the psychedelic sound was going out of style, and he was struggling with finding his new thing. Could have been metal. Could have been metal. It seems like a logical choice for him to go into with guitar solos and stuff. Paul McCartney tells another story about how he saw Jimi Hendrix play in a theater with a bunch of people. It was like a show. It was not a bar, but it was a big show. Jimi Hendrix had become a thing, and Eric Clapton was in the audience, and Jimmy started using the whammy bar, and when you do that, it throws the guitar out of tune because it like unstretches the strings and then stretches them back, and they get caught on the nut, and it like just messes up the tuning. So he was out of tune, and he asked. From the stage, Jimi Hendrix asked if Eric Clapton would come up and tune his guitar. And Eric Clapton didn't do it. He wouldn't do it. Which is hilarious because he was probably so... I mean, if you can think of Eric Clapton at the time, he was considered a god. You know, he was this... probably considered the greatest guitar player. What a humiliating thing to do, to go up on stage and tune someone else's guitar for them. So I could see why I didn't do it. Cream, 1967, Sunshine of Your Love, and Tales of a Brave Ulysses. Song, Sunshine of Your Love, Cream.
Before Hendrix came to the London scene, his inarguable guitar hero was Cream's Eric Clapton.
Right.
Cream had released their debut in '66, the blues rock inspired Fresh Cream. But Hendrix's arrival energized the band to more psychedelic heights. 1967's Sunshine of Your Love was bassist Jack Bruce's attempt to write in his style.
I've been waiting so long.
He played this gig that was blinding. I don't think Jack had really taken him in before. But when he did see it that night, after the gig he went home and came up with the riff. It was strictly a dedication to Jimmy. And then we wrote a song on top of it. Unaware that it was a tribute to him, Hendrix covered the song live on many occasions in an accelerated instrumental form. One particular take delayed the BBC One news by a couple of minutes after Hendrix stopped midway through playing Hey Joe and dedicated his version to the recently defunct Cream.
Well, I just stopped playing this rubbish and dedicate a song to the Cream.
Sunshine of Your Love's parent album, Disraeli Gears, also features Tales of Brave Ulysses, with Clapton's heavy soloing.
That sounds Hendrixy.
And sword and sorcery lyricism.
Her name is Aphrodite, and she rides a crimson shell.
Both were elements that would be retained and expanded on within the metal of Led Zeppelin, Iron Maiden, and many others. Despite this, some of the band have been less than happy about their supposed children. Said drummer Ginger Baker, "People say Cream gave birth to heavy metal. If that's so, we should have had an abortion.
Yo, I've heard stories about Ginger Baker. He was a difficult person. He was a contrarian. He probably didn't really think that. He was just being contrarian. It's what they do. You know? Let's give him a break. There's probably some jealousy and envy underneath that comment. And maybe some substances. You know? He was an angry man. Good drummer. Good drummer. American Psychedelic Rock, 1967 to 68. Vanilla Fudge, Blue Cheer, Steppenwolf, and Iron Butterfly. Song You Keep Me Hanging On, Vanilla Fudge.
At the same time in the US, psychedelic rock bands were creating their own beautifully distorted noise. New York's Vanilla Fudge made a name for themselves by producing hard-rocking versions of pop songs. Their epic 1967 reinterpretation of The Supremes' You Keep Me Hanging On was a particular highlight.
Set me free, why don't you, baby?
Oh, I like it. Nice.
We used to slow songs down and listen to the lyrics and try to emulate what the lyrics were dictating. That one was a hurting song. It had a lot of emotion in it. If you listen to Hanging On Fast by The Supremes, it sounds very happy, but the lyrics aren't happy at all.
Yeah.
But their impact on metal wasn't just by rocking the shit out of Motown hits. When Led Zeppelin first toured the United States, it was in support of Vanilla Fudge. In the psychedelic boomtown of San Francisco, amongst Jefferson Airplane and Janis Joplin, Blue Cheer were also trying their hand at metallifying classic songs. In this case, Eddie Cochran's Summertime Blues.
No, there ain't no cure for the summertime blues.
Oh,
Inspired
yeah.
by the heft of Hendrix's set at the Monterey Pop Festival, Blue Cheer were the point where psychedelic rock morphs into something that can be recognized as metal. Distorted, loud, and deep in the low end.
But Lord, I tried to call my baby, I tried to get a date.
Other musicians in the Frisco scene, though, weren't into the sheer volume of Blue Cheer's sound. People just thought we were making noise. They thought we were a detriment to the scene. I remember Mike Bloomfield came up to me and he says, "You can't do that." I said, "Come on, Mike, you can do it too. All you gotta do is turn this knob up to 10. Released in January 1968.
Mike Bloomfield, he was Bob Dylan's guitarist, right? Let me just make sure I know what I'm talking about. Yes, Bob Dylan. Very influential guitarist.
All you gotta do is turn this knob up to 10. Released in January 1968, it is one of the first properly heavy-sounding songs to make it onto the pop charts, beating the other main contenders for first metal song by months. That said, it didn't have a name yet. In May 1968, a review of the Electric Flags, A Long Time Coming, had the first mention of heavy metal in relation to music. This is the new soul music, the synthesis of white blues and heavy metal rock. But despite having a track called Killing Floor, the Electric Flag were not heavy metal.
No.
The Los Angeles-based Steppenwolf have a more valid claim, with 1968's Born to Be Wild.
I don't know, it sounds a little too happy to be metal, doesn't it? I feel like it needs some more minor chords in there.
Originally written by songwriter Mars Bonfire and intended to be a folk ballad, Steppenwolf got hold of it, cranked up the tempo, and added some driving, hard-rocking riffs. Its verse features the line,
I like smoking lightning. Heavy metal thunder.
but rather than the music, Bonfire was referring to his new Ford Falcon. But because of its use in Easy Rider, the song forever linked motorcycle culture with heavy metal. But the track's message of freedom and optimism was antithetical to the bleakness of the emerging metal genre. Also in 1968, San Diego's Iron Butterfly were perfecting that darker tone with the 17-minute long Doom Led Inagada da Vida and
That's
its
commitment.
ghoulish pounding organ.
My parents had that record. I'll never forget the album cover.
Sonically, it embodied the growing darkness of the 60s, post-Summer of Love. That song was only about a minute and a half long when it started. That song took on a life of its own.
I guess
it just
so.
kept going and going. The
kidding.
engineer just left the tape rolling. The producer wasn't even there when we recorded it. Despite its garbled title, Inagada da Vida was a definite move forward in the newborn genre. Its length, musicianship, and killer riff would be taken on by the next generation of bands. Everyone from Black Sabbath to Slayer were clearly fans.
Okay. It's starting to come together. There are a lot of bands in here I haven't heard of. These guys, the Blue, what were they called? Blue Cheer. I don't think I've ever heard of them. What's their top song? Show me your Apple Music. Summertime Blues. It sounds like ass. Open ass. But I see what they were going for. It would make an impression on me if I had not heard something like that before. Okay, I get it. British psychedelic rock, 1968, The Beatles, The Pretty Things, and Deep Purple, song Helter Skelter, The Beatles.
While recording the disjointed yet masterful White Album, the Beatles' Paul McCartney decided that he didn't want to be known as the soppy ballad writer anymore, dusted off his Little Richard Holler, and wrote Helter Skelter as a means to outdo The Who. The track features some of the dirtiest chugging riffs and heaviest drums of any track available in 1968, performed by the guy who wrote Yesterday. The Beatles recorded the song as an extended jam for hours on end, playing harder with each successive take. By the end of take 18, the one on the record, Ringo hurled his sticks across the studio in frustration and unleashed his iconic outburst.
I got blisters on my fingers!
As well as making proto-metal that little bit heavier, the song would also, unfortunately, make the end of the 60s a fair bit darker. Supposedly, Charles Manson interpreted visions of racial violence and spawned his cult after hearing Helter Skelter's jagged textures.
The power of music.
Also out in 1968 was The Pretty Things' SF Sorrow, one of the first rock operas, and depending on who you ask, it was either an influence on The Who's Tommy or had nothing to do with it. On this grab bag of London-based psych rock was the single Defecting Grey. It was not a hit, but amid the usual acid rock weirdness, it has moments of metal heaviness and
That's terrifying.
It has moments of metal heaviness and musicianship in line with the rest of proto-metalers in 1968.
Whoa, wow. It's really starting to sound like metal now. So far, I don't think any of these recordings have really captured the guitar tones, you know? They're like too scratchy to be metal guitar tones, but this is getting close. There's a wah on it.
But this heavier metal sound was getting to be such a prevalent trend in rock music that even the Turtles of Happy Together fame were trying their hand at their own brand of heaviness on
Really?
Buzzsaw. 1968 was
that
also
works.
the year that Deep Purple formed. Their rocking cover of Joe South's Hush the same year was a significant US hit, inspired in part by Vanilla Fudge.
I never thought of that song as heavy, but I guess it is, by their standards. It's interesting, you know, the effect of Vietnam on all this. It's a big issue, but record labels wouldn't let them sing about it specifically. It was like taboo. You were not supposed to do that. But it was coming through in the sounds they were getting. It was an aggression and anger. I'm hearing it. It's coming.
It wouldn't be until 1970 with Deep Purple Mark II, the introduction of vocalist Ian Gillan, and their In Rock album, where they would have a truly far-reaching impact on metal. But Deep Purple were not the only British hard rock band that had to evolve beyond their original form to become truly essential.
The Yardbirds are in this? Okay. The Yardbirds, 1963 to 70, For Your Love, Dazed and Confused, and Whole Lotta Love. Oh, Song for Your Love. Oh, because Jimmy Page was in the Yardbirds. So was Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton, and a few other people.
Since 1963, the Yardbirds had been experimenting within the blues rock and psychedelia with varying levels of success. Their first lead guitarist had been Eric Clapton, who left to form Cream after recording the lightweight For Your Love because he felt the single was beneath him. He was replaced with Jeff Beck. When he left in 1966, some guy called Jimmy Page stepped in and recorded on the band's final 60s album, Little Games. But when the rest of the Yardbirds left, Page had some Scandinavian tour dates he was contracted to play, and so he hired some replacements. John Paul Jones on bass, Robert Plant to sing, and John Bonham on drums.
The new
For the shortest
Yardbirds.
time, they were known as the
Right.
New Yardbirds.
Right.
But before long, they changed it to Led Zeppelin. Released at the start of 1969, their debut was a chest-beating, fist-pumping mix of the hardest blues rock and psychedelic experimentation. Closing side A is Dazed and Confused, a track heavily inspired by the Jake Holmes song of the same name.
Inspired, or copied?
I'm dazed and confused. For so long it's not true.
That Page had played as an extended jam live during his tenure in the Yardbirds. It's heavy, but in a different way to the blunt heaviness of Blue Cheer or Helter Skelter. Instead of distorted as fuck shouting and noise, Dazed and Confused is restrained, uses sonic light and shade, and is perfectly paced, so that when that freak out hits, it hits hard.
It's dynamic. Yeah.
By their second album, Led Zeppelin were writing experimental yet bone-crushing assaults like Whole Lotta Love. You know that scene in Apocalypse Now where the American soldiers fly into battle, musically accompanied by Wagner? Well, in 1970, what they were actually using was Whole Lotta Love.
Really?
It's a terrifying image. Bloodthirsty, heavily armed children fueling themselves with the heaviest, most violent music available. But it's oddly exhilarating too, and that's the genius of the song. Zeppelin turned teenage sex drive into apocalyptic, precision-tooled violence.
Wow, that's well said. So the soldiers over in Vietnam were listening to this stuff. Wow. Bloodthirsty, heavily armed children fueling themselves with the heaviest, most violent music available. They're probably doing that now, right? They're probably listening to, I don't know, what's a heavy band now? Metallica, are they heavy anymore? I don't think so. Sorta. Technically. I don't know. It's probably some band that's so heavy I've never heard of them because they're just, most people won't listen to it. I don't know. Who's heavy now?
And because of them, heavy music would not be the same again.
Okay. 1969, King Crimson, Pink Floyd, and Coven. Song 21st Century Schizoid Man, King Crimson.
As well as Led Zeppelin's debut and follow-up, in 1969 other bands were stretching the boundaries of the nascent metal genre. In October, King Crimson erupted onto the scene with the psychedelic prog of their first album, In the Court of the Crimson King. The first song on that album, 21st Century Schizoid Man, is a 7-minute hellstorm of gonzo guitar, shifting meters, and nasty sax.
Sax.
Admittedly, the saxophone is not an instrument that metal as a whole would take to heart.
No.
But when combined with Robert Fripp's Mondo guitar riff, it sounds like little else. Its jazz-style
sounds like a
time
guitar.
factory also expanded on what Hendrix had started previously, setting up Rush, Yes, and much later, Tool, Mastodon, and Porcupine Tree. The proto-metal proggery from 1969 was also present in Pink Floyd. While they are a band mostly considered on the heaviness scale as somewhere between rock and hard rock, their live take on B-side Careful with the Axe Eugene from Uma Guma features a scream from Roger Waters that is so anguished and sustained that it must have galvanized at least one metal vocalist, be it Rob Halford, Bruce Dickinson, or any number of thrash metals.
Oh yeah.
While their music was a less heavy version of blues-influenced psychedelic rock,
Wicked woman, you go to hell.
Chicago's Coven influenced metal thematically with their 1969 album, Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. It was
Whoa.
the first rock album that's music features references to the sign of the horns, inverted crosses, and the phrase, Hail Satan.
Okay.
Satan! Hail Satan!
That's terrifying. That's where it comes from. Wow. Yeah, that would make an impression on me. Even now, hearing it, I don't know, what is it, 50 years or something later? That's terrifying. Wow.
Unlike later bands that used these symbols, they weren't for merely shock value or because metal. These were frontwoman Jinx Dawson's genuine beliefs, steeped in family tradition. Also, coincidentally, the first track on their album is called Black Sabbath.
What? Wow. What year did that come out? 69. Okay. Yeah, this is a lot more complicated than I thought. I thought it was just Black Sabbath made a record and metal was created. Black Sabbath, 1970. Black Sabbath song, Black Sabbath, Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath.
In February 1970, Birmingham's Black Sabbath released their self-titled debut, and from that moment, metal had an inarguable year dot. While you can discuss either way on what came before, from the atmospheric doom metal introduction of their title track, Black Sabbath were most definitely metal.
Yeah. That's so
Flavoured by
dark.
the industrial home city, their ultra-heavy sound was developed by accident. While doing sheet metal work, a cutter had come down on guitarist Tony Iommi's middle and ring fingers and sliced the ends off. He was able to continue to play by tuning down his guitar strings and wore fake plastic fingertips made out of a melted down fairy liquid bottle, so he was able to grip easier. This gave a deeper, more ominous tone to his monolithic guitar work. This combined with John Ozzy Osbourne's pain vocals to create a sound unlike anyone else. With their sound,
Wow.
they summed up the end of the Love generation, the one soured by the war in Vietnam, the Manson family, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
These were dark times. Black Sabbath and metal met this with darker music. Alongside them, Deep Purple, Sir Lord Baltimore, Humble Pie, Uriah Heep, Captain Beyond, Budgie, and many others were making similarly metallic
AC/DC.
noises, inspiring the next generations and subgenres to come. Even today, metal still lives on, its followers bountiful, and new bands still taking the genre to strange new places. Metal is still the heaviest, gnarliest music in town. And to think, without Johnny B. Good, we might not have gotten here.
Crazy.
Thanks for watching. Who do you think is keeping metal alive in 2020? Anyway, did you like it? Why not like, comment and subscribe? If you really did like it and all the other stuff I'm doing, why not check out my Patreon?
Hey, y'all, be sure to go to Trash Theory and like and subscribe. This was fascinating. I definitely have heard that Black Sabbath created metal. They started it. But I kind of forget about all the stuff leading up to it, you know? It can be traced back to Chuck Berry, which is kind of wild. And it just builds and escalates. You gotta keep heightening. Gotta keep outdoing the last guy. Or girl. Add a little witchcraft, a little Satan in there. You got metal. I always forget about Tony Iommi's fingers. But that's so fascinating. On his last day of work in a sheet metal factory, I bet it was his last day, as a teenager, Iommi lost the tips of the middle and ring fingers of his right hand in an accident. That accident happened when he was 17. He was told, "You'll never play again." But he wouldn't accept it. He thought there must be a way I can play. After the injury, Iommi's factory foreman played him a recording of famous jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt, which encouraged him to continue as a musician. He wrote, "My friend said, listen to this guy play." And I went, no way. Listening to someone play the guitar is the very last thing I want to do right now. But he kept insisting that he ended up playing the record for me. I told him I thought it was really good, and then he said, "You know, the guy's only playing with 2 fingers on his fretboard hand because of an injury he sustained in a terrible fire." I was totally knocked back by this revelation and was so impressed by what I had just heard that I suddenly became inspired to start trying to play again. Wow. You could say Django Reinhardt started metal, really. That does affect how you play. He basically invented the power chord. So this is for my non-guitar people. So like this is a bar chord, right? Usually I'm playing how many notes? Six strings, right? But you really only need the bottom 3, right? See, I'm not using the cut off fingers. I'm using the 2 that still have ends on them. You can play every chord. Power chords. That's the sound of metal. Anyway, amazing. Although it was an option, Iommi never seriously considered switching hands and learning to play right-handed. In an interview with Guitar World magazine, he was asked if he was ever tempted to switch to right-hand playing. He said, "If I knew what I know now, I probably would have switched. At the time, I had already been playing 2 or 3 years. That's not long. And it seemed like I had been playing a long time. I thought I'd never be able to change the way I played. The reality of the situation was that I hadn't been playing very long at all, and I probably could have spent some time around learning to play right-handed. I did have a go at it, but I just didn't have the patience. It seemed impossible to me. I decided to make do with what I had, and I made some plastic fingertips for myself. I just persevered with it." Wow. To play left-handed, he fitted homemade thimbles to his injured fingers to extend and protect them. The thimbles were made from an old fairy liquid bottle. Oh. Melted it down, got a hot soldering iron, and shaped it like a finger. And cut sections from a leather jacket to cover his new homemade prosthetic. Homemade prosthetics are a bad idea usually. It's kind of gross, but I guess he had to do it, which created 2 technical problems. First, the thimbles prevented him from feeling the strings, causing a tendency to press down very hard on them. Second, he had difficulty bending strings, leading him to seek light gauge guitar strings to make it easier to do so. However, Iommi recalls that such strings were not manufactured at the time, so he used banjo strings instead. Later, he also began tuning his guitar to lower pitches, although Iommi states that the main purpose of doing so was to create a bigger, heavier sound. Slacking the strings made it easier to bend them. Iommi reflected in 2016, saying that his greatest regret is losing his fingertips. It became a burden. Some people believe the accident invented heavy metal. It helped me invent a new kind of music. I play a new sound and a different style of playing and a different sort of music. Really, it turned out to be a good thing off a bad thing. But I don't know whether it did. It's just something that I've learned to live with. It affects your playing style. You can't feel the strings, and there are certain chords I can't play. Right at the beginning, I was told by doctors you won't be playing guitar, but I believed I could do it, and I did. He did it. What a guy. What a persevering motherfucker. Amazing. Good for him. Well, y'all be sure to go to Trash Theory and like and subscribe. I'd like to thank my patrons. I'd like to thank my Buy Me a Coffee folks. Thank y'all for watching this with me, and I'll see you next time. Later.